October 1943, the dawn of a new era in naval warfare. The United States Navy stood poised to take the offensive in the Central Pacific. For 2 years, the American war machine had been gearing up for this moment, churning out ships, planes, and well-trained men for the job. What had emerged was the Fast Carrier Task Force, a powerful collection of ships built around the brand-new Essex-class flat-tops. The soul of the Fast Carrier, its reason for being, was its air group. Consisting of dive bomber, fighter, and torpedo squadrons, the new air groups gave the Americans unparalleled flexibility to launch both offensive and defensive operations. Here off the shores of Wake Island, the largest American carrier task force yet assembled was poised to send these new weapons and this new generation of warriors into battle for the first time.
I was in Butch O'Hare's squadron. Butch is the Medal of Honor winner. They named O'Hare Field after him in Chicago. And Butch had us so trained whereby if we're going down for a section or based on a number of planes, he'd take the outside plane and I'd shoot, a section lead would shoot at the inside plane. So I ended up firing at my plane and I was right on target and we practically disintegrated. And I did notice that the lead plane landed at Wake Island. I kept my eye on him on the thing, and so I figured, well, I'll go down and burn that plane on the ground. Now, he had skittered off the runway after he landed and pulled off to the side, and so Willie Callan was my wingman, and I went on down and I burnt the plane on the runway, and as I was zigzagging across the field to pull back up again, I noticed that there was a Betty bomber parked on the side of the runway. So I came around and made another pass and got it.
The Wake raid was but a taste of what the U.S. Navy was now capable of, a glimpse of its awesome potential. Beginning with Wake in the fall of 1943, the Fast Carrier Task Force was the instrument America used to strike telling blows on Japan's outer defense perimeter. Yet little more than a year before, the U.S. Pacific Fleet, now steaming confidently across the Pacific, was staggering like a punch-drunk fighter, clinging desperately to the ropes. Two months after the Battle of Midway, on August 7, 1942, Marines of the 1st Division landed at Guadalcanal. It marked the first American offensive of World War II and rocked the Japanese command. If the Americans were allowed to establish an airbase in the Solomons, the Japanese naval headquarters at Rabaul would be directly threatened, as would future plans for moves against New Guinea and Australia. The Marines' toehold on Guadalcanal had to be eliminated.
The main reason for seizing Guadalcanal was the incompleted Japanese airfield located on its northern plain. The airstrip was only marginally useful at the time that the Marines occupied that area, and the Marines quickly took it over and named it Henderson Field in honor of the Marine dive bomber commander who had been killed in action at Midway.
Admiral Yamamoto's plan to dislodge the Marines, despite his disastrous repulse at Midway, included many of the same false assumptions about his American opponents. On August 21st, transports bearing 1,500 men departed Rabaul and rendezvoused with a powerful carrier task force sent to support operations ashore. Yamamoto hoped to draw the American fleet into battle and planned to detach a diversionary group baited with the light carrier Ryujo to attract the American flat-tops.
Japanese doctrine was extremely complex. The Japanese were great believers in dispersion and in decoy forces, and they kept to that pattern absolutely throughout the war for as long as they had a viable navy.
Admiral Jack Fletcher's carrier groups, built around Enterprise, Saratoga, and Wasp, had been patrolling south of the Solomons since August 9th, outside the range of Japanese search aircraft. Based on radio traffic analysis, Fletcher was aware that a large Japanese force had sailed.
Following the Battle of Midway, the Japanese began to change their codes more frequently, and those efforts kind of forestall American moves to gain intelligence by breaking their codes. But we're still able to gather intelligence from traffic analysis. And by that I mean from the amount and frequency of radio traffic, we can define the amount of activity being carried out by the Japanese, but we are no longer able to tell what the intention of that activity is.
Catalina search planes located the Japanese transport convoy bound for Guadalcanal on August 20th. However, the supporting carrier task forces went undetected. To make matters worse, a dispatch from SINCPAC indicated all Japanese carriers were north of Truk, and in light of this report, WASP departed to refuel on the 23rd. When a Guadalcanal-based aircraft sighted a Japanese carrier force the next day, 30 Dauntless dive bombers and 8 torpedo-carrying Avengers were immediately launched from Saratoga and set out in pursuit, unaware that their target was the diversionary force centered on Ryujo. Just minutes after Saratoga's strike force had formed up, Navy PBYs and scouts from Enterprise located the real threat, the fleet carriers Zuikaku and Shokaku. But communications failures prevented Admiral Fletcher from diverting his aircraft. As Yamamoto had hoped, the Americans had launched a major strike against a minor target. As the SBDs and TBFs closed in on Ryujo, their plan of attack was largely dictated by the performance characteristics of the aircraft they flew.
It was preferable for the dive bombers to attack first so that their bomb hits and even the near misses could be of use in reducing enemy visibility, would make it easier for the torpedo planes to make their approach, which of necessity was at very low level, often as low as 50 feet, at perhaps 120, 130 knots, very low speed. The third element in the equation was fighter aircraft, both friendly and enemy. The purpose of the escorting fighters was to engage the enemy's defending fighters and, as much as possible, keep them away from friendly dive bombers and especially from torpedo planes, which really had very little room to maneuver.
The wisdom of fighter cover was proven emphatically at Midway, where the Japanese decimated unescorted U.S. torpedo squadrons. But in spite of improved air cover, problems still plagued American aviators.
The U.S. Navy's main problem throughout all of 1942 into 1943 from a torpedo viewpoint was simply reliability. The Newport Torpedo Station in Newport, Rhode Island had produced the Mark 13 Bliss-Leavitt design starting probably in the early 1930s, and it was a flawed design from the start. It was essentially a destroyer-mounted torpedo that was hastily adapted to aviation use. And we went through a number of cycles before we finally got to the point where American torpedoes were reliable enough to justify the exposure of torpedo crews to enemy defenses.
As with Shoho at the Coral Sea, Ryujo was overwhelmed by the strength of the American attack. Dauntless dive bombers scored several hits before an Avenger sent a torpedo into the hapless ship. Ryujo never had a chance, but she had served Yamamoto's purpose. Meanwhile, Admiral Nagumo, commander of the carrier force, ordered his planes aloft, certain that the Americans had flown off all their planes to attack Ryujo. Admiral Fletcher, however, had not forgotten the lessons of the Coral Sea or Midway, and he had 53 Wildcats aloft waiting. The initial exchange was strictly a pilot's battle, as American and Japanese planes tangled outside the anti-aircraft gun range of Enterprise and her screen of escorts. Dive-bombing Vals and torpedo-launching Kates, covered by a screen of Zeros, scrimmaged wildly with the American planes. At 1641, Japanese dive bombers that eluded the combat air patrol commenced their run as American ships opened up on the tiny silhouettes of the Japanese planes. Wildcats slashed at them as they came down, risking friendly anti-aircraft fire, but the Japanese pilots never faltered. Enterprise twisted and turned, trying to avoid the coming onslaught, but at 1644 hours, a 1,000-pound bomb crashed through her aft elevator and detonated between the second and third decks. 35 men died instantly, and the ship quickly acquired a list as seawater poured in through several gaping holes at the waterline. Ship and crew had just 30 seconds to recover before a second bomb struck close by the same elevator and exploded below, obliterating the aft starboard 5-inch gun battery and its crew. Effective maneuvering allowed Enterprise to narrowly avoid a third hit, but just seconds later, yet another bomb detonated on impact near the number 2 elevator. It punched a 10-foot hole through the flight deck, disabled the number 2 elevator, and killed or wounded several more men. A mile and a quarter astern of Enterprise, the battleship North Carolina also drew the interest of enemy pilots. At least 10 Vals made a coordinated attack, but their bombs splashed harmlessly in the water. The Japanese attack, which missed Saratoga completely, was over in a matter of minutes. Enterprise, listing and pouring out smoke, still raced along at 27 knots. Damage control focused on extinguishing the blaze set by the second bomb. Men with hoses played streams of water on the flames, while others spread foam to smother burning fuel. Within an hour, the damage control parties had brought the fires under control, patched over the hole blown in the flight deck by the third bomb, counterflooded to correct the ship's starboard list, and improvised plugs for the waterline holes with lumber and mattresses. At 1746, an hour after suffering her third bomb hit, Enterprise turned into the wind to receive aircraft.
Eastern Solomons was not a major battle by later standards, or even certainly compared to what had already transpired at Coral Sea and Midway, but within the Guadalcanal campaign itself, it pretty much set the pattern for the next several months. We now had on both sides combat experienced aviators, some of whom had been in one or more of the previous carrier battles, and you also had a growing institutional experience with the ship's companies and commanders who had fought each other previously.
Enterprise had survived to fight another day, but was fortunate when a second Japanese strike failed to locate the crippled ship. As it was, the Battle of the Eastern Solomons ended indecisively. The Japanese had lost Ryujo and a considerable number of aircraft and their pilots, but they had succeeded in crippling Enterprise. The most significant fact in the aftermath of the battle was that the Americans had spoiled Yamamoto's plan to dislodge the Marines on Guadalcanal. Following the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, dive bombers from Enterprise landed at Guadalcanal and were there for nearly a month.
Throughout the campaign, Henderson Field became either a divert field or a semi-permanent base for U.S. Navy carrier aircraft. Lieutenant Commander Turner Caldwell led his Dauntlesses into the field as an expedient means of avoiding a night recovery aboard Enterprise, and such was the need by that time that they were immediately absorbed into the generic organization of what became known as the Cactus Air Force, and were significant in the effort to keep Japanese shipping from adequately resupplying enemy forces on Guadalcanal.
Time and again, the Dauntlesses more than proved their worth as anti-shipping aircraft, sending numerous transports and warships to the bottom. Yet such successes came at a heavy cost. Fully half the crews in the original SBD squadrons failed to return from Guadalcanal. Others ended up in the drink during anti-shipping attacks and were fortunate to be rescued by American seaplanes.
I got hit by AA and made a landing in the drink. The plane floated for about 5 minutes, 4 to 5 minutes, and we got out and went right by our practice, and everything worked out good. Except I lost one of my shoes.
Meanwhile, the F-4F squadrons fought a grim battle of attrition with raiding Japanese Betty bombers.
Japanese land-based naval aviation was built almost exclusively around a Mitsubishi design that they called the G4M, and which we called the Betty. It was a fairly large twin-engine aircraft capable of delivering either bombs or torpedo. Excellent range, good turn of speed, but its crews learned early on that it was highly susceptible to sustained battle damage, and for that reason, it was called not only the Type 1 land attack aircraft, but the Type 1 lighter.
Although the Cactus Air Force fared well against the Betty, the problem from the American standpoint was being in position when the bombers arrived.
With the F-4F-4 Wildcat, which was the only fighter available at first, approximately 45 minutes advance notice was needed in order to be in a favorable position to attack the Japanese bombers before they could actually drop their bombs.
Fortunately, a network of observers stationed throughout the Solomons was often able to notify the Americans of incoming raids. When they did, the Wildcat was able to use its best characteristic, its diving ability, to launch hit-and-run raids against the Japanese bomber formations.
The Japanese usually flew at about 18,000 feet, and it worked. This was a tactic that worked at higher altitudes because the F-4F would gain momentum as it dove and run away from zeros. But according to some of the aces and pilots that I've spoken to over the years, including General Marion Carl, in a dive from 10,000 feet, the Wildcat and the Zero were pretty much even, and so your Wildcat pilot at lower altitudes would have a harder time getting away from a Zero than, say, at higher altitudes as they were fighting above Guadalcanal.
In spite of the best efforts of the men defending Guadalcanal, the situation in the Solomons grew steadily worse as the threat of Japanese land-based airstrikes forced the United States Navy into a difficult and perilous situation. With the Cactus Air Force still too few in number to provide adequate air cover, it was left to Saratoga and Wasp to keep the air umbrella extended above Guadalcanal. This was achieved by keeping both carriers on a dangerously predictable beat as they plied the 400-mile stretch of water between San Cristobal and Espiritu Santo. They were not alone. On August 31st, a Japanese submarine torpedoed Saratoga, and while she managed to limp away, the damage was enough to force her out of action for 3 months. 2 weeks later, Wasp suffered a similar fate in the waters of Torpedo Junction.
Wasp had just recovered a flight of SBDs when a Japanese submarine launched what may arguably be described as the single most effective torpedo attack ever conducted in naval history. With one spread of torpedoes, sank the aircraft carrier Wasp, blew the stern off a destroyer, and also damaged a battleship, and got away clean.
With Hornet now the only operational carrier left in the Pacific, the Americans could do little to prevent the Japanese from reinforcing Guadalcanal. Nearly every night, more Japanese soldiers landed on the island, and the daily air raids and nighttime bombardments from Rabaul-based planes and ships continued. By the middle of October, Japanese strength on Guadalcanal rivaled that of the Americans. All signs pointed to a major offensive, and it came on October 20th when the western perimeter of the American position on Guadalcanal came under assault. As General Vandegrift's hemmed-in garrison struggled to meet this latest threat, away to the north, the Japanese combined fleet was poised to exploit the inevitable capture of Henderson Field. The Japanese October offensive marked yet another critical juncture in the Guadalcanal campaign. As the Marines and soldiers of the Americal Division battled the Japanese, the freshly repaired Enterprise and her task force rendezvoused with Hornet east of Espiritu Santo, forming Task Force 61 under Rear Admiral Thomas Kincaid. Admiral Halsey, anticipating a Japanese move into the waters northeast of Guadalcanal, ordered Kincaid to sweep north of the Santa Cruz Islands to engage the Japanese fleet.
The Japanese Army and the Navy, in a rare display of serious inter-service cooperation instead of rivalry, mounted a multi-phased attack on Guadalcanal. This was a genuinely serious effort to throw the Americans off the island and end the Allied threat to their southern flank. Coincident with this was the next and last carrier battle of the Guadalcanal campaign, which was the Battle of Santa Cruz, which occurred on the 26th of October.
The Japanese surface force outnumbered the Americans by a ratio of more than 2 to 1. But the evolution of naval warfare had made another factor much more important. 4 Imperial carriers would match 199 planes against 2 American carriers supporting just 136.
I remember we were called to a meeting in the wardroom, briefing us on the coming contact with the Japanese fleet, and that we were going to have an engagement. And this was going to be our first combat experience for us. We knew where they were, they knew where we were, we just kept closing on each other. I guess go back to the Civil War, you know, and you just knew you were coming and you were going to meet head to head.
As in all the previous carrier engagements, the first task was finding the opponent.
In the U.S. Navy, the basic scouting unit for a carrier air group was 2 aircraft, almost always 2 SBDs, but later 1 Dauntless and 1 Avenger. But they would fly a wedge-shaped sector, perhaps 150 to 200 nautical miles out, about a 50-mile cross leg, and then the equivalent distance back to what they call point option. The trouble is, you're not leaving from an airport. You're leaving from a ship that can move as much as 30 knots. So if you're flying perhaps a 2-hour mission or a 3-hour mission, the ship could be quite a ways from your launch position, and that's the reason that naval aviators were required to be such expert navigators. So navigation was extremely important to it, and also communications. It doesn't do you much good to find the enemy if you can't tell your base where they're located. The most reliable type of radio communication was CW, continuous wave, which required the use of Morse code. It was longer ranged and more reliable than voice radio. And that's the reason that the enlisted man sitting in the back of every SBD was cross-trained. Whether his rating was as an ordnanceman or a radioman, he was equally proficient in aviation weapons, especially machine guns for defense of the aircraft, and in radio, not only sending and receiving Morse code, but maintaining and repairing the radios. So just because an individual is sitting in the back of the bus looking where he's been rather than where he's going does not mean that he's any less a part of the reconnaissance team than the pilot. He's very much a full partner.
The opposing forces spent the night of October 25th zigzagging as their patrol planes diligently searched. One Japanese force was located about 0300, but the position report failed to reach the American carriers. Enterprise did, however, pick up another message from Halsey consisting of 3 terse words: attack, repeat, attack. At dawn, Enterprise turned into the wind and sent the 16 SBDs of Scouting Squadron 10 in search of the enemy. 200 miles northwest of the Big E, Scouting 10's commander found the task force containing Shokaku, Zuikaku, and Zuiho.
Naval aviators were intensively trained in overwater navigation, and by and large they did a superb job of it. There was one episode which allowed a 2-plane section to navigate from their own assigned search sector to another sector approximately 80 to 100 miles away, accurately and quickly find the Japanese carriers and deliver an effective dive bombing attack, and they got away clean.
With the advantage of having the sun behind them, the 2 SBDs plunged unopposed on the light carrier Zuiho. At 0840 hours, their 500-pound bombs ripped open her aft flight deck and forced her out of the fight. But unfortunately for the Americans, Zuiho's air group had already departed. At 0820, 65 Japanese aircraft had been launched against an American carrier force, which was now known to be nearby. The first full American strike, numbering 29 planes, had left Hornet at 0840, and at 0900, Enterprise added 20 more. When Hornet launched another 25 planes at 0915, the battle finally achieved a delicate numerical balance, but the Japanese enjoyed a significant head start.
We were escorting the bombers, which were TBS and SBDs, and we were at about 10,000 feet, and we were trying to conserve fuel because we had a long way to go and a long way to come back, so we were under low power settings and and just barely staying with the bombers. They were a lot slower than we were.
Less than an hour into their mission, the American Air Group stumbled across an inbound Japanese formation of Vals, Kates, and Zeros. The Zeros left their charges and dove down to hit the surprised American planes.
We didn't see them at all until they hit. They did shoot down a bomber and a torpedo plane and 3 out of the 4 fighters that were in the other group.
I had thought there were probably about a dozen of these things circling around, and we were real slow, had our drop tanks, which we had to drop, and we had to cock our guns and so forth. Well, the Chip's drop tank dropped successfully, but he forgot to switch the fuel from the drop tank to the main fuel tank, and mine wouldn't drop. It would not release at all. And in the meantime, the Zeros are just shooting the heck out of us. But anyway, Chip got his engine running again, and so we spread out into what was called the thatch weave. All of a sudden, my rudder bars went to the firewall. What had happened, another Zero had made a run on me and cut my rudder wires, and my engine had just before that gone dead stick, and I have this prop out there which is acting as a brake, and I was turning into land into the wind on the ocean. Stood up in the cockpit and kicked the stick forward. At the same time, I was pulling my ripcord, and kicking the stick forward made the plane dive so that I was ejected. And it was kind of a parabola. I was ejected a little bit higher than the altitude I was currently at, which probably helped. And it also, the forward speed helped, opened my chute. And it jerked open just about the time I hit the water, and it was very fortunate for me that I had reached the bottom of my first swing, and when I hit the water, hit it pretty hard. Eventually it was picked up by a Japanese destroyer.
With Air Group 10's strike a shambles, the Japanese reached Hornet and drove home their attack. Assailed by anti-aircraft fire, the dive bombers came in first. One bomb hit the starboard side of the flight deck, and then 2 near misses rocked the ship. Next, a Val crippled by anti-aircraft fire crashed through the stack and into the flight deck, where its bombs detonated. Then the Kates came in, skimming in low to avoid anti-aircraft fire, and they sent 2 torpedoes into the engine room. Hornet lurched to a stop as 2 more 500-pound bombs struck aft and a third slightly forward. In 5 minutes, Hornet had become a blazing, drifting hulk. "20 minutes after Hornet's ordeal began, her first strike wave of dive bombers and their escorting fighters reached Nagumo's carrier force, 200 miles to the northwest.
The SBD had a rear gunner for a very good reason. A dive bomber squadron would fly a stepped-down echelon which unmasked the rear guns in each airplane so that they had a clear field of fire, at least on the horizontal and the vertical plane, without having to be concerned about shooting low into any of the other friendly aircraft. And that arrangement did work. The Hornet SBDs fought a running gun battle inbound to the Shokaku, and they lost, I think, 3, perhaps 4 SBDs, but were able to keep the Zeros at bay long enough to reach the pushover point and successfully put their bombs on the target.
11 SBDs staggered Shokaku with at least 3 1,000-pound bomb hits, which wrecked both her hangar and flight decks and forced her to turn away. The strike capacity of each side had now been cut in half, but the balance was short-lived. At about 11 o'clock, Japanese Vals began dropping out of the sky above Enterprise. Anti-aircraft fire from the Big E and her screen claimed several enemy attackers, but 2 bombs hit home, the most serious jamming her forward elevator.
They were using armor-piercing and semi-armor piercing bombs, 250-pounders. Went through the flight deck, and one of them exploded on the hangar deck, right where the 4 airplanes that we had just been in were spotted for refueling. That destroyed those airplanes. We had gotten other flights into the air that took off just before we landed. It's a normal launch recovery cycle. So we have no more airplanes aboard that we could man. So I'm caught on the ship along with that division, the pilots, and we went through the attack, not in the air, but in the ship. So I didn't get to fly against the opposing forces.
It was like watching, rather than feel like him being attacked, it was like watching a movie. There go the ships, and everybody's shooting, and it was noisy because those 5-inch guns, I could watch it and move away from the guns. I didn't have anything to do till we got hit. And we did get hit. A bomb dropped on turret 1, which didn't do any damage except, didn't do any damage that I was aware of. The turret officer was looking out he has a little spyglass that he could look out, and the side glass, he got a black eye.
Going out of the ready room you just didn't sit in the ready room. We had no airplanes to fly, and went up on the flight deck, and there were attacks going on. There were dive bombers coming in and torpedo planes coming in, and the ship heeling and the guns firing. People had their sidearms out firing at airplanes, and it was comical in ways, but pretty heart-stopping in other ways. And didn't even have a hard hat. I just had that cloth helmet on. We took a look at that and just decided might as well get back in the ready room. That's where our station is.
Invariably, when we ever got hit, we were in a turn, because if we got bombers coming down on us, we're trying to get off underneath them, of course, and that ship they'd put it hard over. We'd go over about 22 degrees and be turning on an outside turn, and then you get hit while you're on that turn, and the ship was just pulsating.
When these bombs had hit the ship, and even those that missed, the concussion would lift that 37,000-ton ship, and it would lift up and shake like a dog.
It seems like the ship stops, and it's suspended, and all of a sudden it has this real sickening side shake to it. It's hard to explain, but it had this sick shaking going sideways, and it just then the ship would come down and settle, and then we'd go on with a turn, and whang, we'd hit again, and then she'd start that side shake again. And it was a terrifying experience.
Kate torpedo planes that survived the gauntlet of Wildcats and anti-aircraft fire mounted an anvil attack, and only superior maneuvering saved Enterprise, as 3 times she narrowly avoided torpedoes. More bombing attacks followed, but anti-aircraft fire again limited the enemy's success. At 12:35, after fending off an unsuccessful 4th attack by 15 Vals, Enterprise turned into the wind to take on planes.
The Big E was able to limp away, absolutely chuck-a-block with airplanes from her own air group and from Hornets. And one of the classic examples of landing signal officer importance occurred when Lieutenant Robin Lindsay, who was the senior LSO aboard Enterprise, told his talker to pull the phone jack when the ship's captain ordered him to stop landing airplanes.
The LSO, a fellow named Robin Lindsay, landed 2 of us anyway. I was the next to the last, and they pulled me over, and I was parked underneath the 5-inch guns that the Enterprise had. And the last pilot, when he stopped, they left him right out in the landing area.
With 95 planes packed aboard, Enterprise was exceedingly vulnerable to further air attack. Knowing that his decision likely doomed Hornet, Admiral Kincaid ordered Task Force 61 south and out of the battle area. He directed Hornet's screen to follow as soon as they were able. In the meantime, Hornet's men were working furiously to save her. Initially, their efforts looked promising, but the inability to repair her engines sealed her fate. In the late afternoon, a half-dozen Kates caught the carrier plodding along at 3 knots and launched torpedoes. Only one hit, but one was enough.
Later that day, that was evening or close to evening, we had to sink the Hornet. It was so badly damaged and dead in the water that we actually, the destroyers, put it away with torpedoes and got the crew off and so forth. We had a lot of our air group aboard our ship. Now we're down to a disabled Enterprise. The Saratoga's in Pearl Harbor with a hole in her that you could put a Greyhound bus in, been torpedoed, and this was our naval carrier striking force at the time, and it was decimated.
A bold sign appeared in the hangar deck, Enterprise versus Japan, reflecting the desperate nature of the situation. Scarred from numerous hits at both Eastern Solomons and Santa Cruz, Enterprise would have to hold the line until a new generation of carriers, along with a new generation of aircraft, reached the beleaguered Pacific Fleet. Naval air power had proven critical to the Pacific War, but the accomplishments of 1942 had come at a dreadful cost. 4 of the 6 carriers that had seen action in the Pacific were gone, and with them, a tremendous number of aircraft and men.
The air groups had been savaged in this year-long fighting in the South Pacific and at Midway. They had taken just traumatic losses. What the Americans needed to be more effective was a new generation of aircraft that would be eminently more survivable than what they had been fighting with in 1942. And those aircraft began showing up in early 1943.
It started with the Chance Vought F-4U Corsair. Built around the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 radial engine, the Corsair offered an unsurpassed blend of power, speed, and rate of climb. Faster than anything the Japanese had, the Corsair became the first Navy aircraft to surpass 400 miles per hour in level flight.
That was really a major, major achievement for a carrier-based aircraft, especially in those days when the conventional wisdom held that a carrier airplane simply could not be as capable as a land-based aircraft. But the Corsair, for all its potential, which eventually was proven in spades, suffered an unusually long gestation period.
The Navy received the first production models of the F-4U in July 1942, and that October, VF-12 became the first squadron to be equipped with the Corsair. Though the aircraft performed flawlessly in the air, carrier trials revealed several problems with the F-4U.
At first, on the F-4U-1s, they couldn't land them on the carriers. They just were, the green pilots, they just couldn't handle that Corsair going aboard a carrier.
When you're approaching a carrier, you're in a tight turn with your cowl flaps open, and as you line up on the deck, those cowl flaps block off the landing signal officer.
Carrier landings required the pilot to have the plane at stall speed just as the tailhook snagged the deck wire. But the wicked stall characteristics of the F-4U made this very difficult.
The torque from a 13-foot, 3-inch prop is so violent that it'll turn that airplane over. And that's one of the problems they had. You had to keep your airspeed up.
Assuming the pilot landed intact, the Corsair normally bottomed out the shock absorbers as it slammed down on the deck.
The oleo shocks on the early Corsair would go down and then pop up, and you miss the arresting gear.
Because of the early Corsair's flight characteristics, veteran Navy pilots referred to F-4Us as the Ensign Eliminator.
The Corsair was a negative stability airplane, which cost a lot of lives with young, green fighter pilots.
When I was at El Toro, we had an average of 2 fatal crashes a day. But when you knew the aircraft, there was nothing like it.
Unsure if the F-4U would ever be suitable for carrier operations, the Navy sent the Corsair to the Marines, who fell in love with the plane's raw power. Here at last was a plane that could beat anything in the air.
I chose to go in the Marine Corps because at the time of my graduation, the Navy was not yet
using these on-board carriers. And I recall the first time I took a Corsair off, I flew 11 miles before I pulled the landing gear up because the lever was clear down by your left foot. You had to duck your head down below the cockpit to reach it, and when you did that, you couldn't see what was going on outside. And that's an uncomfortable feeling in an airplane like that the first time you fly it.
Once the Marines came up their learning curve, they found the Corsair to be highly maneuverable and relatively easy to fly.
We had a mock-up with the cockpit, and we studied that. One guy inside, the other guy outside, quizzing him, and then we'd swap places. And when we got pretty familiar with the cockpit and finally got an airplane, we started up, taxied out, and took off. You use the trim tab on takeoff in a Corsair constantly. You set some rudder trim in before you applied the power, so it was there and you wouldn't have too much to do. But mainly you used elevator trim on takeoff. As you broke ground and so on, I had one hand from the throttle to the elevator back and forth. It was an easy airplane to fly, easy to land, everything.
Early in 1943, VMF 124 was the first squadron to take the F-4U into battle. Operating from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, the Marine pilots soon discovered they had a real zero killer in the Corsair. Within 6 months, all USMC units in the Pacific were equipped with the F-4U. Using energy tactics to counter the Zero's maneuverability, Corsair squadrons racked up an incredible kill-to-loss ratio of over 10 to 1. While Marine squadrons were proving that the Corsair was a superior ground-based fighter, back home, Vought engineers had corrected the problems that made the Navy hesitant about using the F-4U aboard carriers. By April 1943, VF-12 had successfully completed deck landing qualification.
Well, unfortunately for the Corsair squadrons, that news did not trickle where it needed to go, and consequently, when, for instance, Commander Tom Blackburn's VF-17 was ready to go to war aboard the Bunker Hill in the summer of 1943, they had an all-up round. They had a superb fighter aircraft, a decent carrier aircraft, but the Bureau of Aeronautics didn't know that, and consequently did not have the spare parts in the carrier pipeline that would have been necessary to support the aircraft. Consequently, it wasn't until virtually the end of 1944 that Corsairs went to sea aboard American aircraft carriers in anything other than dribs and drabs.
The slow development of the F-4U as a carrier-based aircraft could have been a serious problem for the U.S. Navy. Fortunately, Grumman had produced a successor to the Wildcat that gave wartime naval aviators the edge over their Japanese counterparts. That fighter was the legendary F-6F Hellcat. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat entered combat in the fall of 1943 and was a major player in the Pacific Naval Campaign thereafter. Powered by the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 radial engine, Grumman built the Hellcat to be rugged, fast, and maneuverable. With a top speed of 380 miles an hour, the Hellcat was faster than the Zero and most Japanese Army fighters it faced. Its 650 caliber machine guns packed a wallop and could shred any Japanese plane in seconds.
The F-6F was an incredible improvement over the F-4F. It had no unusual characteristics, very stable plane, very good gun platform, and one of the best carrier planes there was for bringing aboard ship.
The Hellcat was the best fighter of World War II. An excellent gun platform. It's a very steady airplane. We called it an old man's airplane because it was easy to fly. If you got slow, I had to say, hey, you're getting slow here, you better do something, or, and if you didn't, well, then you could get in trouble that way, but you knew.
One pilot said about the aircraft behind me, if it could cook, I'd marry one. And that was a universal feeling about the F-6F Hellcat, which entered combat in August of 1943 and was the Navy's frontline carrier fighter until the end of World War II. The F-6F was a versatile aircraft, not only in air-to-air combat, but it could launch rockets and it could drop bombs. So later in the war, it became a true fighter bomber. As the U.S. offensive moved gradually closer to Japan, it not only fought off the kamikazes, but was able to strike land targets, perform fighter sweeps, and it was a do-it-all aircraft.
Hellcats destroyed Japanese air power, even allowing for the errors in aerial victory credits. Hellcats were credited with around 5,200 enemy aircraft shot down. And that figure alone is almost exactly equal to the total number of Japanese aircraft credited shot down by all Army Air Force fighters, not only in the Pacific, but in the China-Burma-India theater as well, where there were no naval aircraft at all. So clearly, the Hellcat, of which some 12,000 were built, was the most important fighter aircraft of the Pacific War.
There's a persistent myth in aviation history that the Hellcat was designed basically as a zero killer from the outset, and that the design was based on the flight testing of a Zero that was captured up in the Aleutians in June of 1942 that's known as Koga Zero. Well, this is simply untrue. Koga Zero was captured long after the design of the Hellcat had been completed, and in fact it was starting to enter the pre-production stages by the time that the aircraft, the Zero, was actually brought to the U.S. and evaluated. But what Koga Zero did do was show that some of the things that had been incorporated in the Hellcat's design were going to really make it an effective platform against Japanese naval fighters.
The Hellcat was reliable enough to operate far from mainland hangars and repair depots, and rugged enough to take massive battle damage and still get the pilot home.
It was durable. It could withstand all sorts of hits and still survive.
And the radial engine was great because it would get you home when the liquid cooled and inlines wouldn't. I've seen them come back with cylinders blown right off the engine, and they'll still fly, which that can't happen with an inline engine or a liquid cool.
And the best thing you could say for the F-6 was it was built by Grumman Iron Works. It was a really solid airplane, self-sealing gas tanks, armor plate where it was needed, in the oil tank, under you, behind you. It was just a fine aircraft.
In the Hellcat, American pilots had a war winner that would soon clear the skies of Japanese planes. No longer would they fight at a terrible disadvantage. Now, it was the Japanese who would fight with the odds against them. Paired with the Hellcat was the TBM Avenger, a Grumman-designed torpedo plane manufactured by the Eastern Aircraft Division of General Motors.
The Avenger was the replacement for the TBD Devastator, and Grumman produced them in 1942, and they were called TBF-1s. They first saw action at Midway and then later at Guadalcanal, but at the end of 1942, Grumman was fully committed with building Hellcats, and they were out of production space. They just didn't have enough room in the factory to build both Hellcats and Avengers at the rate that the Navy needed. So they subcontracted to General Motors to produce the Avenger, and those General Motors built aircraft were known as TBMs.
It had a couple hundred more horsepower than the TBF, and made quite a difference taking off, especially when you had 400 or 500 pound bombs. That extra 200 horsepower was quite helpful.
Vastly superior to the Devastator, the Avenger offered a remarkable blend of speed, ruggedness, and firepower. Able to carry over 4,000 pounds of bombs and rockets, capable of steep dives, wave-hugging torpedo runs, and level bombing attacks, the Avenger's versatility made it the best carrier-based strike aircraft of the war.
The Grumman TBF Avenger went from strength to strength, and even with the lack of adequate torpedoes through the end of 1942, still made a name for itself, not only as a bomber, but as a very long-ranged scout and reconnaissance aircraft. And it also did a superb job in the Atlantic and later in the Pacific as an anti-submarine aircraft with a variety of weapons.
The Avenger took part in every carrier versus carrier battle from Midway onwards and proved that it could absorb astonishing amounts of battle damage and still get its crew home.
It could take a beating. I've seen planes come back with their tail all bashed up, and they still made it back. And my plane was hit a couple times. always made it back, and it was a great plane.
However good the Avenger was, the battles of 1942 proved beyond a doubt that the offensive power of the carrier air group resided in the bombing squadrons. They provided each air group with the ability to deliver crushing blows against both ships and shore installations. Now 36 planes strong, the bombing squadrons in the fall of 1943 had not yet completed the transition to newer equipment. Consequently, when the Navy unleashed the fast carriers in the Central Pacific, two types of dive bombers served with the fleet. Some squadrons still flew the venerable SBD Dauntless, while others, some would say less fortunate, were issued the Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver. Intended as a replacement for the Dauntless, the SB-2C turned out instead to be the air group's new weak link.
The SB-2C was sort of rushed along in its design. They tried to put a lot of hydraulic features on the aircraft, and that just wreaked havoc with the entire design and the entire early history of it. So it had those problems associated with it. And also how naval aviators measure an aircraft in many respects is how it performs around the boat, so to speak, or how it performs in carrier operations. And these early ones, when landing on an aircraft carrier, the tail hook sometimes would bounce when they hit. The entire back end of some of these aircraft just totally ripped off. And so you had some problems when it came to that. And really, though, the people who really complained a lot about it were the mechanics who had to deal with the hydraulic problems.
We had some attached to the squadron at North Carolina. They were the earlier ones. And they had 5 of them. I think 2 is the most they could keep in commission at the time. They were a plumber's nightmare. I understand there was 8 miles of hydraulics in that. Even the seat, the gunner seat in the back was hydraulic. And it seems like something was always going wrong.
Though it carried twice the bomb load of an SBD, Helldiver pilots learned that their new mount was unstable. Trying to hold the nose on a target during a dive became a wrestling match, and accuracy suffered. The Helldiver also exhibited poor low-speed stability and dangerous stall characteristics, tendencies that earned it the nickname the Beast. Some joke that SB-2C stood for son of a bitch second class.
The SB-2C was a difficult airplane to fly, in my opinion. You had to be a contortionist as a pilot to fly that thing. The cockpit was inconvenient. You needed an extra joint in your arm. To get the wheels up, you had to pull up an old lever like we used to have on the old two-way plow out on the farm.
Not particularly fast and a chore to keep in the air for pilots and mechanics alike, the Beast never met the expectations the Navy set for it. In months to come, the Helldiver would more than earn a reputation for mediocrity.
The SB-2C Helldiver really never shook its reputation for being a problem-plagued aircraft, even though most of those problems were later fixed.
The subsequent models of the SB-2C were the -3, -4, and -5 models, and to a large extent, those were different airplanes. Curtiss had re-engineered them, had made some few hundred production line changes in order to make it a more reliable, a safer aircraft, and by the end of the war, it was making a name for itself as a reliable, fairly maintainable carrier airplane, but it simply never had the opportunity to do for the U.S. Navy what the SBD had done, especially in the critical first year after Pearl Harbor.
By late 1943, the United States Navy Air Arm was loaded for bear. The desperate defensive battles of 1942, fought by a handful of carriers against staggering odds, were in the past, as the U.S. Navy prepared to embark on the most sustained naval offensive in history, an offensive that would carry the war to the very shores of Japan.